Negative gearing is off the table.
Yeah, it's off the table.
Can you rule out any changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax?
Yes. How hard is it for the 50th time? I told people we wouldn't make changes. The proof's in the pudding.
Well, Labor's controversial changes to capital gains tax and negative gearing is this morning under fresh scrutiny.
One of the reasons why we're making these changes is so that first home buyers get a fair go.
The concept that negative gearing capital gains tax is either the cause of the problem or the solution to this problem is just a distraction.
Today I want to step back from the headlines and talk about what the budget is attempting to do to Australian property. Because most of the commentary right now is about negative gearing. And yes, negative gearing is part of it. Capital gains tax changes are an even bigger part of it. But if all you're hearing is they change the tax rules for investors, you're missing what's actually going on. This budget is trying to change who gets to own Australian housing over the coming decades. It is trying to change what new investors decide to buy, who first home buyers compete with, and what developers are able to build. Ultimately, how millions of households make often the biggest financial decisions of their lives around property. I sit across from families making those decisions every day. We settle hundreds of loans a year, literally now thousands over the years at Alcove. So I see what they are actually considering, the different challenges they face year after year, and where the real pressure points are before any of it shows up in any media headline or city property index. So in this video, I want to explain the problem the government is responding to, why property carries so much weight in the Australian economy, and what the policy changes actually shift. It's important to say these budget changes are still proposed policy. They are not law yet. The legislation still has to be introduced, debated and passed, and the final version could change. So in this video, it's not about pretending every detail is locked in. It's about understanding the direction of travel, the incentives the government is trying to change, and how buyers, sellers, investors may respond if these rules do proceed. Before we get into the policy, you need to understand why the government treats property like a loaded gun when it comes to any kind of reform. Because if you don't understand how deeply property is wired into the Australian economy, everything the budget is trying to do will feel like an overreaction. Or more importantly, you'll underestimate how far the consequences could actually be. In April 2026, the total value of Australian residential property was estimated at $12.6 trillion, with only $2.6 trillion of mortgages against it. Over 55% of household wealth is in residential property. When you look at this chart, it is much larger than super, the ASX, government and corporate bonds, bank deposits, all combined. So size matters, but the reason it matters is what lies beneath it. Our major banks have the largest exposure to mortgage lending, and those banks are a huge portion of the Australian share and super portfolios. So you've got this situation where property values feed into bank profits, which feed into super returns, which feed into consumer confidence. The construction industry is one of the country's biggest employers. Our high migration strategy only works if people can actually be housed once they arrive. And our retirement often looks completely different whether you own a home or you're still renting. So when a government weighs up changing national tax settings, it's weighing up the largest part of household wealth: economic stability, retirement security, rental pressure, state taxes. Ultimately, will Australia remain the place where younger people here and from overseas want to build a life? That's why every government for the last 20 years has been extremely cautious about touching these settings. On a global level, Australia is already one of the wealthiest countries in the world per person. UBS ranks us second only to Luxembourg for median wealth per adult in their 2025 reporting. But that wealth is not evenly experienced. For many older households, the family home has been the best financial decision they've ever made. It's been the driver of family wealth across generations. For younger households, that same wealth created by buying a home has become what they're trying to break into. And increasingly, the gap between getting in and not getting in is less about income and more about whether there's help from the bank of mum and dad and increasingly the bank of grandparents. If you look at ownership rates by age, back in 1971, 64% of 25 to 34-year-olds owned a home. By 2021, that had dropped to 50%. And the 35 to 44 bracket went from 70 down to 60%. And that gap keeps widening because the entry price keeps moving further away from a single income and even a dual income without family help can reach. So Australia's housing problem is not just a supply problem, it's also an allocation problem. And when 55% of total wealth is already baked into the system, Australians have an enormous amount of wealth inside residential property, not just the family home, but in investment properties, holiday homes, second homes, empty homes, land, properties not matched to our society's need. However, it's mostly held by older households who entered the market at an entry price much lower. That's why this budget is a much bigger story than the headlines suggest, and the consequences go well beyond investment returns. And the government knows it. Labor has been floating this debate for a long time. They took these changes to the 2016 and 2019 elections, including limiting negative gearing to new housing and changing the capital gains tax discount with grandfathering for existing arrangements. They later backed away from the policy and before the 2025 election explicitly ruled out these changes. So yes, this is political dynamite and they are burning enormous political capital in attempting to make this change. But in fairness, it shouldn't also be a complete surprise because the housing problem they were worried about back then hasn't gone away. If anything, it has become much worse for younger Australians trying to buy a home. Australia is a wealthy country, but housing insecurity has become much more visible. National Housing Supply and Affordability Council shows public housing waiting lists are close to record highs at 169,000 households. ABS census data from 2021 estimated that 122,000 people were homeless on census night. In New South Wales, recent reporting showed waiting times of several years for social housing. And this is where the politics get uncomfortable. For decades, the government on both sides have heavily relied on private investors to provide large share of rental housing. At the same time, they step back from providing sufficient public and social housing themselves, while failing to ensure that enough affordable housing was being built across our cities. They kept tax settings that made property investing attractive, and they benefited politically from rising house prices because existing homeowners felt wealthier. So while investors are now being blamed for a lot of the pressure, the reality is that the government helped create the incentives that push capital in existing housing in the first place. That does not mean the system should never change, but it does mean we should be honest about how we got here. Furthermore, renters have been under serious pressure. Rents nationally have risen over 40% in the past 5 years, adding $200 a week to the median rental household's cost to around $700 a week. Vacancy rates remain unbelievably tight, under about 2% nationally. So for renters, the fear is not just paying more. It's being told that the owner is selling and you have 60 days to move. And you don't know whether you'll be able to find another home in your suburb, near your work, or near your children's school. And for renters, the latest Quartality data shows rental growth is accelerating again, not slowing. So if you've been renting, you've been absorbing this pressure for years. The desire to own something of your own has arguably never been stronger, because renting has become more expensive, more competitive, and less secure. But for many renters who can't yet buy, there's still very little light at the end of the tunnel. Then there's this divide between who's getting into the property and who isn't. First-home buyers have more government support than they've had for a long time. 5% low deposit schemes, state stamp duty concessions, new shared equity schemes, the First Home Super Saver scheme. But support doesn't remove competition. First home buyers have been going up against investors, upgraders, and buyers backed by intergenerational wealth. That competition has been the strongest at the exact price brackets where younger buyers are trying to enter. Part of that is population growth and natural household formation. Part of it is we haven't built enough housing of all types. And part of it is that investor demand has been the heaviest in the more affordable parts of the market. So the government is looking at the property system that has created enormous wealth for some households and a life of insecurity for others. And the gap has been getting wider. That's the pressure this policy is responding to. And it's why they've gone back to a policy they walked away from, even though it's a political train crash. The other thing you need to understand is that all of this is happening at a really difficult and confusing time. And the timing changes how the policy plays out, because how the budget lands looks very different depending on where you are. In May 2026, the RBA lifted the cash rate to 4.35%, with further increases on the near horizon and higher rates expected for longer, citing renewed inflationary pressure and combined global uncertainty. That has flowed straight through to how Australians are feeling. Consumer confidence has been at historic lows. And Roy Morgan estimated that 1 in 4 mortgage holders were at risk of mortgage stress. So while unemployment is still low by historical standards, it is rising rather than falling. People are increasingly worried about their future job opportunities and the impact of AI on their skill set. So the government is changing incentives at a time when confidence is extremely low, lending is highly constrained, and many households are financially stretched. And on top of that, the property market isn't one market. It's thousands of sub-markets operating under the same headlines, but with different fundamentals. Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide have had enormous runs over the last 5 years. Perth is up over 90%, Brisbane over 80%, Adelaide around 75%. But the key point is not just headline city growth. It is that the more affordable entry point families rely on has grown the most strongly, both inside those cities and in the commutable regional and out and suburban markets around them. Meanwhile, Sydney is only up around 17% over the last 5 years. Melbourne has barely risen. Those markets have been much more affected by higher price points, interest rates constraints on borrowing capacity and overall sentiment. But even within Sydney and Melbourne, the story is not uniform. Houses owned by owner-occupiers have behaved differently from apartments. Apartments in investor-heavy areas have behaved differently from owner-occupier areas with often quieter streets. Affordable outer ring suburbs have behaved differently from premium markets. To be fair, some unit markets have been more resilient than many expected. When rents rose sharply and affordable alternatives disappeared, the combined first home buyer support and growing investor participation meant even unit markets that once looked weak had a strong buyer pool. That's why any national statement like the budget will make property go up or the budget will make property fall is just too simple. It would depend on the price point, the property type, the city, the suburb. Most importantly, who the next buyer is for that specific property in that marketplace. Now, the obvious answer to all of us is build more homes. And yes, Australia needs more homes. But the gap between approving a housing project and getting it built is where it gets difficult. It directly affects whether the budget's supply-side goals are actually achievable. The homes Australia desperately needs right now are medium and higher density dwellings in our capital cities. So apartments, townhouses, infill housing. Well-located density near jobs and schools and transport, and those are the hardest homes to actually deliver. Construction costs are much higher than before COVID and show little stability. Master Builders Australia reported that building a new detached house was 48% more expensive than before the pandemic. Even though detached housing has had the biggest cost inflation in the ABS index, higher density housing remains much more expensive and complex to deliver per square metre, which is why feasibility is so difficult. Furthermore, builder insolvencies have been much more elevated since 2022. So the industry that is supposed to deliver this new supply is under real strain. Building residential housing is competing with government infrastructure and commercial construction for the same labour and materials. That makes it even harder for the housing we need most to get out of the ground. If you look at the supply gap, the Housing Accord target is 240,000 new dwellings a year. Actual completions have been running between 170,000 and 180,000. And the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council projects only around 940,000 homes by 2029. Which is roughly around a 260,000 shortfall for the 1.2 million target. So even when zoning changes, approvals get granted, and governments announce these huge targets, the real question is whether projects actually get out of the ground. In the current environment, a large share of theoretical supply is unlikely to be delivered unless feasibility improves, either through higher end values, lower construction costs, cheaper finance, faster approvals, or the government just taking risk out of the process. So the budget will continue to have a supply problem. The government is trying to direct investor capital towards new housing, but it can't force projects that don't stack up financially to get built. And that gap between intention and delivery is one of the biggest risks of this whole policy. So we've talked about the new supply problem, but the demand side is just as important. When you see where investor money has actually been going over the last few years, the government's decision to act makes more sense. Westpac have found that investors account for 39% of new lending in 2025. It's the highest share since 2017. Invested lending values were up 32% over the last year. And the broader point is that investor activity has moved towards levels last associated with the earlier investment booms, including the period around 2015, when APRA stepped in multiple times to slow down credit growth and tighten riskier lending. And when you look specifically at investor lending, ABS data suggests that only around 20% of investor loan value has been going towards construction of new dwellings. Roughly $4 out of every $5 is going to established housing. And on top of that, it's been concentrating in the more affordable segments of the market. Outer suburbs, established apartments, townhouses, older villas, and many regional locations. The exact same segment where first home buyers have been trying to buy. The government's view is that the current tax settings have been encouraging investors to compete for existing homes, often directly with younger owner-occupiers while adding almost nothing to new supply. So if you combine this with a post-COVID population surge, growing household formation, combined with falling household sizes, the demand becomes even clearer. All of those households need somewhere to live. And when supply does not keep up, that pressure flows first into the rental markets and then into purchase prices. Less than 20% of new investor lending going to new dwellings is the budget problem in one sentence. Investor capital has been flowing to existing housing, competing with first home buyers in the more affordable parts of the market while adding almost nothing to supply. That's why the government is trying to redirect that capital, not remove investors from housing altogether, but redirect them towards adding new supply. The budget's two main tools it's using are changes to negative gearing and changes to capital gains tax. They work together in a way that a lot of coverage is oversimplified. The first change is negative gearing. If you buy an established investment property after budget night, future losses won't be deductible against your salary or other non-property income after 1 July 2027. Cash flow losses can be used against other residential rental income or capital gains if the investor has other properties. If not, they can carry forward those unused losses for future years. But the key point is the ability to offset property losses against your wage income this year goes away for purchasing established properties. Existing investment properties held before budget night are grandfathered. So if you already own a property, your negative gearing position is protected. And the tweak here is that new housing keeps full deductibility. So if you buy or build something that generally adds to supply, the old rules still apply. Now, negative gearing has been more than just an end-of-year tax benefit for new investors. It has arguably been the enabler for them to consider investing in the first place. It shapes borrowing strategy, and the tax deduction massively improves the ongoing cash flow. It's the story they tell themselves that helped them consider investing in the first place. They were willing to accept an often considerable net loss each year in the hope that many years in the future, the annual loss would be much smaller and with greater capital growth. So when negative gearing changes, it changes more than the tax returns. It changes what some investors can afford to pay, or even if they want to invest at all. The second change is to capital gains tax, and this is where grandfathering is much more complicated than most people realise. Under the proposed rules, gains accrued before the 1st of July 2027 keep the current treatment, but gains after that date move into the new regime, with a cost-based indexation plus a 30% minimum tax on gains. So existing investors aren't simply grandfathered forever on all future growth. They're protected only to the 1st of July 2027. After that, future gains are treated completely differently. Let me put some numbers around the cash flow side of this so you can see what it means in practice. Take $1 million investment property. The investor borrows 105% of the property value using equity from another property to cover the purchase price, costs and stamp duty. At a 6.5% interest rate, that's around $68,000 a year in interest on a $1.05 million of debt. If the property has a 4% gross yield, that's around $40,000 a year in rent. Then minus off around $10,000 a year in ownership costs, rates, insurance, repairs, management, vacancy, and possible strata or land tax depending on the property and state. That puts the property at roughly a $38,000 negative cash flow before tax. And if the yield is only 3%, which is common in a lot of capital city markets, the rent drops to $30,000 a year and the negative cash flow blows out to $48,000 before tax. Under the old rules, investors could use that loss to reduce their taxable income from work. Under the proposed rules for future established property investors, that loss is quarantined. So you can still invest in established properties, but the economics look very different now. And for future potential investors, the amount they can borrow, can afford to hold, and desire to invest in property is completely shifted post-budget, given current market conditions. Now, many investors will hear grandfathered and feel reassured. And they should feel reassured because the existing negative gearing position is protected. But capital gains tax is only protected to the 1st of July 2027. There are, however, second-order effects that most people aren't thinking about yet. They matter not only if you own an investment property right now, but if you're planning to buy any property. The price of an investment property isn't set by the current owner's tax position. It's set by the next buyer, the price they are willing to and able to pay. But the person who would buy that property from you in the future is going to be operating under a completely different set of rules. If this proceeds, they won't be able to offset losses against their salary in the same way. They may face a less favourable capital gains tax treatment on future growth. Their borrowing capacity may be lower because the tax deduction that supported their serviceability has been removed. So the question for existing investors isn't just, is my tax position protected? It is. The better question is the pool of buyers who would pay the price I expect for the property still the same size after the budget? Will other investors want to sell? And are future buyers still willing to pay what I think it's worth? The budget is deliberately changing the answer to that question. It is making it much harder for the next investor to buy established property. And if the next investor either can't afford to pay the same price or decides the numbers no longer work on that property, that flows back into the current value of existing investment properties, even the ones that are grandfathered. That's why this is a much bigger story than tax. It's about who gets to own Australian housing next, how different parts of the markets may be repriced when the next buyer is operating under a different set of rules. The reason I'm telling you all this is the policy intention is only the first layer. The government has laid out what it wants to happen, but whether it actually plays out that way depends on how millions of households respond. That's where it gets much less predictable. Will first home buyers be able to, or even want to buy the homes that investors step away from? Will rents rise if investor activity pulls back before new supply arrives? Will prices fall in some segments but keep rising in others? Will investors shift to high-yielding regional markets, new apartments, commercial property, shares or super? Will existing investors sell or hold even tighter because their grandfathered position is now more valuable? And will developers actually build more homes? Or will the construction costs, finance, pre-sale risk mean more of the theoretical supply never gets delivered? The market impact comes from how people respond, and that's what we'll cover in the next video.